Ladies and gentlemen, in a world overflowing with information, confidence has often replaced wisdom, and the illusion of intelligence has become more common than intelligence itself. Today, we explore a fascinating psychological phenomenon: why some people believe they are far smarter than they actually are, and why this illusion becomes a barrier to growth, self-awareness, and real competence. This mindset is not born from malice. It is a defense mechanism, a cognitive trap, a psychological armor people wear to protect themselves from insecurity, inadequacy, or failure. When someone overestimates their intelligence, they aren't intentionally deceiving the world. They are deceiving themselves. The Dunning-Kruger effect reveals one of the strangest truths about human psychology. The less a person knows, the more certain they often become. This illusion of superiority doesn't come from arrogance alone. It comes from a genuine inability to recognize the limits of one's own mind. When a person lacks skill, insight, or knowledge in a specific area, they also lack the ability to understand what true competence looks like. In other words, they don't know enough to see how much they don't know. This creates a dangerous loop. Low ability leads to high confidence, and high confidence prevents the realization of low ability. The mind protects itself by constructing a false sense of mastery, a comfortable lie that feels safer than the unsettling truth of ignorance. Imagine someone who has never deeply studied psychology but confidently believes they understand human behavior better than experts. Or someone who watches a few videos online and suddenly feels superior to people who have spent decades in research. This is not stupidity, it is a cognitive error built into the human brain. The mind wants coherence, certainty, and simplicity. Admitting complexity threatens the ego. So many people choose the illusion of intelligence over the discomfort of learning. They interpret their limited experiences as universal truths, their shallow understanding as deep insight. This creates a psychological barrier where self-awareness cannot enter, because self-awareness would expose the gap between who they think they are and who they actually are. The most interesting part is that truly intelligent people often underestimate themselves. They are aware of the vastness of what they do not know. Their humility is not weakness, it is the result of a mind mature enough to see its own limits. Meanwhile, those trapped in the Dunning-Kruger illusion experience the opposite. Their confidence grows because they do not see the boundaries of their knowledge. They mistake oversimplification for clarity, opinion for fact, and certainty for intelligence. The result is a level of boldness that can be mistaken for competence by others, which only reinforces the illusion further. This psychological trap becomes even stronger when combined with emotional insecurity. When someone feels inadequate deep down, the illusion of intelligence becomes a coping mechanism. Believing they are smarter than others gives them a sense of control and superiority. It shields them from criticism, because criticism threatens the fragile identity they've built. Instead of learning, they defend. Instead of questioning themselves, they justify. Instead of seeking growth, they seek validation. This is why you often see individuals who insist they are always right, who argue loudly but think shallowly, who demand respect but avoid self-reflection. They aren't confident, they are terrified of losing the illusion that keeps them psychologically afloat. The tragedy is that this illusion blocks progress. Without recognizing one's weaknesses, improvement is impossible. Without humility, no growth can occur. That is why the first step to real intelligence is not knowledge, but awareness. Awareness of your limits, your biases, your gaps in understanding. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a silent thief of growth, stealing people's potential without their knowledge. Only when someone gains enough humility to question themselves does the illusion begin to fade and genuine intelligence finally begins. ****2. Emotional insecurity and fragile ego. People who believe they are smarter than they are often operate from a foundation of deep emotional insecurity. Their exaggerated confidence is not a reflection of true self-esteem, but a fragile facade built to protect a bruised or undeveloped ego. When someone feels inadequate internally, the easiest psychological escape is to convince themselves they are superior. This illusion becomes a shield not just against criticism from others, but against the painful possibility that their own self-image might be wrong. A fragile ego cannot tolerate being questioned, corrected, or challenged. So these individuals respond aggressively to disagreement, not because they are confident, but because they fear exposure. Their defensiveness is a survival mechanism. If they admit they're wrong, their entire self-concept collapses. This is why they interrupt, argue loudly, pretend to know everything, or dismiss information that contradicts them. It is not intelligence speaking, it is insecurity trying to protect itself. Over time, this insecurity creates a psychological paradox. On the surface, they appear bold, outspoken, and even dominant. But underneath, they're terrified of being seen for who they truly are. Someone who doesn't understand as much as they claim. This internal fear drives them to create a persona of superiority, because a false sense of intelligence feels safer than vulnerability. They cannot afford humility because humility would expose the gap between their real ability and the image they cling to. In contrast, genuinely intelligent people are not afraid to say, "I don't know." They do not interpret mistakes as failure, they see them as growth, but a fragile ego sees mistakes as humiliation. It sees questions as threats. It sees learning as an admission of inferiority, and so, rather than expanding their mind, they limit it all to protect a self-image that was never real to begin with. This emotional insecurity also makes them overly sensitive to comparison. They feel threatened by people who are genuinely knowledgeable, so they mock them, belittle them, or accuse them of being too complicated. They prefer environments where no one challenges them because challenges expose the truth. Their relationships suffer, their opportunities shrink, and their potential remains trapped behind the walls they built around their ego. In the end, the psychology behind this behavior shows one of life's sad realities. The people who pretend to know the most often understand themselves the least. Their arrogance isn't confidence, it's emotional fragility wearing a mask. At the core of this behavior lies a fundamental resistance to learning. People who believe they are smarter than they actually are often reject opportunities to grow, because learning requires humility, the humility to admit gaps in one's knowledge, to accept correction, and to recognize that others may know more. For someone whose identity depends on appearing intelligent, humility feels dangerous. Instead of welcoming knowledge, they avoid it because every new piece of information threatens the illusion they have constructed about themselves. This learning resistance becomes a psychological trap. When faced with new ideas, they instinctively shut down or argue, not because the ideas are wrong, but because accepting them would require acknowledging they did not already know something. Their mind becomes a closed room where nothing unfamiliar is allowed to enter. They cling to outdated beliefs, oversimplified opinions, or half-understood facts because these require no effort to maintain. Growth becomes impossible when the mind is locked in self-protection mode. This resistance also manifests in their interpretation of intelligence. They think being smart means always being right, having quick answers, or impressing others with confidence. But real intelligence is about curiosity, depth, and a constant willingness to expand. People who fear being exposed see curiosity as weakness. They don't ask questions because questions reveal ignorance. They don't listen because listening requires opening oneself to new perspectives. And they don't explore because exploration means admitting they haven't arrived. Over time, this refusal to learn isolates them intellectually. They mistake their stagnation for mastery, believing that because they feel certain, they must be correct. In psychology, this is known as illusory superiority. the belief that one's abilities are better than average despite objective evidence showing otherwise. Their certainty gives them emotional comfort but denies them intellectual progress. They end up trapped in the same thoughts, the same patterns, and the same mistakes, repeating them with false confidence. This resistance damages their relationships too. When someone cannot accept new information, they cannot compromise, collaborate, or have meaningful discussions. They become the person who always argues, always lectures, always insists. Others begin avoiding conversations with them because speaking to someone who refuses to listen is exhausting. They don't realize that their unwillingness to learn doesn't just limit their knowledge, it pushes people away. Ultimately, refusing to learn is a silent form of self-sabotage. The world moves forward while they stay in place, convinced they are ahead. They don't grow intellectually, emotionally, or socially. They protect their pride at the cost of their potential. And the tragedy is that the cure is simple: openness, curiosity, and humility. But until they let go of the need to appear smart, they remain locked in the prison of their own certainty, mistaking walls for wisdom. A major psychological pattern in people who are not as smart as they believe is their tendency to oversimplify everything. Instead of acknowledging complexity, which requires patience, analysis, and deeper thinking, they reduce ideas, people, and situations into black and white conclusions. This oversimplification gives them the illusion of understanding without the effort that true understanding requires. It feels easier, safer, and more validating to assume that everything has a simple answer, and because simple answers are easy to grasp, they assume their grasp means intelligence. Oversimplification protects their ego. Complexity threatens them because complexity exposes their limitations. If a topic has many layers, it becomes clear that they may not fully comprehend it. So they reject the layers and cling to surface-level interpretations. They prefer bold statements, quick judgments, and catchy opinions because these make them feel confident. But confidence built on shallow thinking is instability disguised as certainty. The moment reality demands depth, their entire world struggles to hold itself together. This habit also creates a distorted sense of mastery. When someone reduces everything to simple explanations, they walk around believing they get it better than everyone else, but what they really understand is only a fraction of the whole. Still, they convince themselves that the fraction is the full truth. They mistake clarity for correctness and speed for brilliance. Real intelligence thrives on nuance, on seeing contradictions, balancing perspectives, and recognizing what is not immediately obvious. But oversimplification kills nuance. It creates a world where everything is either good or bad, right or wrong, smart or stupid, and in that world they always imagine themselves on the right side. This pattern also fuels their arguments and debates. Instead of engaging thoughtfully, they latch onto the simplest angle, repeating it louder and louder as if volume replaces depth. When confronted with more complex reasoning, they dismiss it as overthinking or making things complicated. They don't realize that the world is complicated. Their minds just aren't equipped or willing to navigate that complexity. So they label anything they don't understand as unnecessary or wrong, further protecting the illusion of their intellectual superiority. In relationships, oversimplification leads to misunderstandings and conflict. They assume they know what others think or feel based on minimal information. They jump to conclusions, misinterpret intentions, and refuse to acknowledge layers in human behavior. Because they can't see complexity in themselves, they can't imagine it in others. As a result, people feel unseen, misjudged, or misunderstood around them, but the person never connects this to their own limited thinking. On a deeper level, oversimplification is a coping mechanism. Facing the real complexity of life, emotional, social, intellectual, requires maturity. It requires the ability to sit with uncertainty, to question oneself, and to accept that the world is bigger than one's own mind. But people who need to feel smart avoid this discomfort. They'd rather shrink reality down to fit their ego than expand their mind to fit reality. In the end, oversimplification makes life feel easier, but it also makes the person smaller. It keeps them from developing wisdom, empathy, and true intelligence. It gives them the illusion of understanding while depriving them of the depth that real understanding demands. Another defining psychological pattern is their inability to learn from mistakes. Because admitting a mistake feels like admitting they aren't as smart as they claim to be. Instead of reflecting, adjusting, or growing, which are essential parts of intelligence, they rewrite the story to protect their ego. When something goes wrong, they immediately blame circumstances, other people, or bad luck. Anything that keeps them from confronting their own role in the failure. This defensive mindset traps them in the same cycle of errors, but they walk around believing they're progressing simply because their ego says they are. This inability to accept mistakes comes from fragile self-worth disguised as arrogance. They have built their identity on the belief that they are consistently superior, competent, or insightful. So when reality contradicts that belief, they experience internal conflict, and instead of evolving, they double down. They rationalize poor decisions, reinterpret bad outcomes, and tell themselves distorted stories where they are always the victim or the exception. Rather than understanding the lesson, they cling to the illusion of infallibility, and because they never allow themselves to be wrong, they never allow themselves to grow. This pattern also affects how they respond to feedback. Constructive criticism, something intelligent people value, becomes a threat. Instead of listening, they interrupt. Instead of considering new information, they defend. Instead of exploring a different perspective, they dismiss it. They might say things like, "You don't get it," "I already know that," or "That's stupid," not because the feedback is wrong, but because acknowledging it would force them to confront their limitations. This creates a psychological bubble where they remain untouched by reality, insulated from improvement by their refusal to learn. And as time passes, this bubble becomes their prison. Because they refuse to look honestly at their mistakes, their relationships suffer. They repeat hurtful patterns, fail to take accountability, and assume others are the problem. People eventually distance themselves because dealing with someone who is never wrong becomes emotionally exhausting. Yet again, they interpret this distance as proof that others are inferior or overly sensitive, reinforcing their delusion instead of inspiring self-reflection. Professionally, the pattern is equally damaging. They may be confident, loud, or bold, but without the humility to learn, they remain stuck at a plateau. They overestimate their abilities, take on tasks they aren't equipped for, and sabotage themselves through poor judgment. When things collapse, they refuse to see the connection between their choices and the outcome. This leads to stagnation, a mind that is full of certainty yet empty of growth. Underneath it all, the psychology is simple. Admitting a mistake threatens their false sense of intelligence. But avoiding mistakes doesn't make them smart, it makes them rigid. Wisdom comes from reflection, from recognizing blind spots, from embracing the discomfort of being wrong. Intelligent people evolve because they see errors as information, not insults. But people who only think they're smart protect their ego at the cost of their potential. In the end, their refusal to learn from mistakes is not just a habit, it's a psychological barrier that keeps them tethered to mediocrity while convincing themselves they're exceptional. Another psychological pattern is their tendency to surround themselves with people who won't challenge them, because being questioned threatens the illusion of intelligence they've built. Instead of seeking out individuals who stimulate growth, debate ideas, or expand their perspective, they gravitate toward those who will validate them, agree with them, or simply stay silent. They prefer environments where they can feel superior, because superiority feeds their ego and keeps their self-image protected. But this choice comes with a hidden cost. It keeps them intellectually stagnant. People who truly value intelligence seek friction. They like being challenged, corrected, and pushed to think differently. But people who believe they are smart without actually possessing depth avoid that friction at all costs. They want admiration, not improvement. They want to be the smartest person in the room, and not because they actually are, but because it feels safe. Being exposed to people with sharper minds or stronger logic would force them to confront the gap between who they think they are and who they truly are. So they carefully curate their social world to avoid such exposure. This selective environment eventually becomes an echo chamber. They repeat their opinions, receive praise from the same limited circle, and start believing that agreement equals intelligence. Instead of evolving, they reinforce their misconceptions. Instead of expanding their knowledge, they recycle the same ideas. People in their circle may know the truth but stay quiet to avoid conflict, since correcting them is often met with anger, defensiveness, or ridicule. As a result, the smart persona remains intact not because it's real, but because no one is willing to break the illusion. Over time, this dynamic shapes their personality even more deeply. They develop a dismissive attitude toward anyone outside their bubble. They see differing viewpoints as stupid, opposing arguments as illogical, and unfamiliar information as irrelevant. They create a mental framework where their opinions are always the baseline, and anything that destabilizes that baseline is automatically wrong. Their relationships suffer because genuine connection requires vulnerability, humility, and openness, qualities they avoid out of fear that their intellectual mask will crack. The irony is that surrounding themselves with weaker voices makes them weaker as well. They lose adaptability because they never encounter ideas that challenge them. They lose self-awareness because they never engage with people who hold a mirror to their flaws. They lose respect because intelligent observers quickly recognize false confidence. And they lose opportunities because growth happens at the edge of discomfort, a place they avoid entirely. In the end, their curated environment becomes a psychological cocoon that shields their ego but suffocates their potential. They may feel safe, validated, and smart, but it is a shallow, fragile intelligence, one that collapses the moment they step outside the room where everyone agrees with them. The tragedy is that they could grow, evolve, and truly develop wisdom, but the fear of not being the smartest prevents them from ever becoming genuinely intelligent. Another defining psychological trait is their inability to distinguish confidence from competence, and this confusion shapes their behavior in ways they rarely notice. They often equate feeling certain with being correct, as if conviction itself is proof of intelligence. When they speak, they do so with absolute certainty, even when their ideas are incomplete or entirely wrong. This deep belief in their own correctness creates a mental shortcut. If they feel right, they must be right. And because they rely on this emotional certainty rather than objective thinking, they rarely revise their beliefs or question their assumptions. This internal certainty becomes addictive. They begin to chase the sensation of being right, the thrill of intellectual dominance, rather than pursuing truth or understanding. As a result, they avoid information that contradicts their beliefs, not because it lacks merit, but because it threatens their psychological comfort. They may even develop cognitive biases, particularly confirmation bias, that push them to selectively seek out anything that supports their narrative while rejecting anything that challenges it. Instead of learning, they curate reality to protect their ego. This mindset also makes them resistant to feedback. When someone corrects them, they interpret it not as a contribution but as an attack. Their ego reacts before their intellect does, and defensiveness overrides logic. They may respond with hostility, sarcasm, or complete dismissal. To them, acknowledging a mistake feels like losing status, and losing status feels like losing identity. This is why they double down even when proven wrong. The psychological cost of admitting error is too high for them to tolerate. In social situations, this trait can make them appear confident, assertive, even charismatic at first. People might initially mistake their certainty for competence, especially in environments where actual expertise is hard to measure. But over time, patterns emerge, their ideas don't evolve, their arguments repeat. Their knowledge appears wide but shallow, and their confidence becomes recognizable not as intelligence, but as bravado. Eventually, people who observe closely begin to see the cracks, the avoidance of nuance, the rejection of complexity, and the inability to say, "I don't know." The tragic irony is that their false certainty prevents the very growth that could make them genuinely wise. True intelligence requires humility, the willingness to admit gaps, question assumptions, and remain open to new information. But because they psychologically equate uncertainty with weakness, they never develop this humility. Their self-image becomes brittle, dependent on maintaining an illusion that collapses under pressure. Over time, this habit limits their potential. They struggle to improve because improvement requires self-correction. They struggle to form meaningful relationships because meaningful connection requires vulnerability. They struggle to gain respect because respect is earned through authenticity, not performance. Their sense of intelligence becomes a cage, trapping them inside a fixed version of themselves that cannot evolve. In the end, their certainty becomes their downfall. They cling to the feeling of being right so tightly that they sacrifice the opportunity to become right. They could grow, learn, and develop real mastery, but as long as they treat confidence as proof of competence, they remain stuck, mistaking loudness for logic and conviction for truth.